So we run our ponds as they are lined ponds with soil put back in because we're basically in sandy clay. This is a state facility, so they can afford it. It's not my facility. I'm a guest there. We run nursery system. I run about a 2-week nursery system because I want to take any mortality from shipping in the nursery, not in the ponds. And so we do, you can call it a quarantine system, you can call it a nursery system, but we run about 2 weeks. So we bring in our PLs, and then we stock out about a 50 milligram animal, I think, typically. Our traditional, what we've been doing for the last probably 16 or 18 years while I've been there, is a 120-day production cycle, so about 16 weeks. We start off with a high-protein 40% crumble, small feed, and then transition to, within a couple weeks, to a 36% protein diet, and run the rest of the production cycle. Example, 2 of the 3 years, this is the diet that was used. It's an extruded diet. It's an open feed formulation that we developed a long time ago. As an example, so you can see soybean meal, we have about 8% animal protein, corn gluten meal, and then basically the rest is your filler. We do make sure to it's a research diet, so extrusion conditions are not optimized, so we add a little bentonite to make sure it's going to sink. But basically it's produced commercially for us as an open formulation. So our first standard feeding protocol, it's twice a day, which is what Latin America does. Okay, that's standard protocol in Latin America. We have a pre-programmed feeding protocol that we use, and we've done lots of work that demonstrates it's very good. We've also done lots of examples where we've changed that feeding protocol and it doesn't improve our performance. But because everybody says, well, you didn't feed enough, so we went up 15%. So 2 feedings a day, 15% more. And then we had the 6 feedings per day, the same quantity here. And then we had the AQ1 running by itself, so it's automated. We've got lots of water quality data. There's an entire paper on it. It's pretty boring, but this is what you guys want to see. So here's 2 feedings per day and 15% more. Basically, we don't change things, and we've done this many times. I can go up in my amount of feed. I'm a very conservative feeder. This gives me the best performance. 6 feedings per day, so the same amount of food going from 2 to 6, we got a boost in performance. Okay, so just feeding more feedings is going to improve things. Okay. And then the AQ1, of course, beat us out by about 50%. And if you want to look at the production, this is at low density because we had PL issues that year. But production goes up, final weights go up. Of course, survivals are reasonable. Feed conversions 1-to-1, we're pretty good at that. Our production per pond, if you want to look at it in terms of feed input, AQ1 fed more. Right? It's doing more feedings. It's managing so that animals are growing faster. So 2017, again, what we're trying to do is demonstrate and transition to these acoustic and automatic feeding systems. So I don't believe anything if you do it once. I want to do it more than once. So we ran our standard feeding protocol once again. We ran our timer feeders, but we increased the amount of feed that we're giving. So what I'm doing is basically ramping up, or my description is, I'm taking my standard feeding protocol, which is no longer valid because now we know that we can get faster growth with more feedings. I got to ramp that up to a new call for automatic feeders. And so we're slowly ramping that up. And then we ran the acoustic system. This is our typical density that we would run is 38 per meter, which we're also not doing. And of course, I do all the work. Now these are the guys that did the work. Again, ran through our production system. I'm not going to talk about management, but basically we have standard operating procedures. And remember, this is all being done by students, and they've never done this before. So we have standard operating procedures, and they are supervised, but basically they're doing all the work. So again, 2 feedings per day, then we ramped up. So I'm using my standard, my traditional feeding as a reference, because I got to have a reference point. So I'll always refer to things as 115, 130, 145, 160, which is back to my 2 feedings per day. And then we ran the acoustic feeding system again. So just to show you data, this is, we ramp up, my ramping up of feeding, and what I did is I plotted, here's my 3 ponds that I've pre-programmed. This is all programmed, so I just do it in advance. And then this is 3 of my ponds that I plotted from the AQ1, just to show you that it's not feeding the same amount every day, okay? And then we put a plateau up here because we have an upper limit of how much feed that we thought we could apply to our ponds, and so I put upper limits, and we did hit those upper limits towards the end of production. Now, I want you to notice a couple things. My standard protocol has been a 120-day production cycle. We're now at a 90-day production cycle, okay? So I've taken 30 days off my production cycle by moving to these automatic feeding systems. So here's 2 feeding per day. We're now at 90, so we can get to a 20-gram shrimp, so that's pretty good growth rates. But with the AQ1, we're just over 30 grams in 90 days, okay? So again, what we're doing is we're essentially ramping up what's going on. So we've got 115, 130%. So this last year, so here's our production, feed, yield, individual weights. Again, we got to 32 grams. This is 90 days. Feed conversions, a little bit higher feed conversion than the AQ1, but typically it's good. One of the things that people ask me about in terms of the AQ1 system, and I don't have an answer, but I do have an example, is whether or not it will respond to biomass changes. So this is an example of a pond. The AQ1, here's it running normally. We then had an algae die-off, right? So phytoplankton crashes, you have aeration problems, your DOs are low. Well, it didn't feed as much when the DOs were low. Then we had mechanical failure and we lost our aerator, so there was a mechanical failure. So we killed a bunch of shrimp. And then, so we shut the system off for a couple days and then we turned the system back on and we lost about 40% of the shrimp in that particular system, so we ended up with about 60% of the production, and it fed about 60% of what the rest is. So it looked to me like in the example where we've seen a mortality issue that it readjusted. Okay, so I think the system is pretty dynamic, and if you have some sort of issue that it will readjust. So this is last year's production data. Again, we're running the timer feeders. Our entire facility is now timer feeders. So we're not doing any hand feeding anymore. We've gone to all timer and acoustic feeding systems. Again, what I'm trying to do is ramp up to get a new feed curve essentially. So we're feeding at 130, 145, and 160% of what our standard calculation is. And then we ran the acoustic system. Now, we did not have a shortage of post-larvae this year, but when we accelerate the growth rate of the shrimp, you accelerate the amount of food you have to put in, right? Your water quality is determined not by biomass, it's determined by the quantity of food you put in, okay? I have realistic limitations on what I can do in terms of aeration and my biological carrying capacity, or at least where I view it is, okay? I may be wrong, but I think I know where we can do maximum. So what we did is we chose to stock only at 25 per meter, okay? So I made that decision because I am now producing a shrimp that's growing faster and I'm producing more feed into the pond. I have to have aeration that'll maintain that quantity, okay? And I have real limitations on how much horsepower I can have running at my facility. Basically, my electrical lines coming in only carry about 15 horsepower per line of ponds. If I exceed that, I blow my breaker, and then everything's dead. So we drop back because I'm a big believer of trying to work within your biological capacity of whatever system you have, okay? We all want to push them, but the reality is when you overcommit to yourself, you're going to have problems. All right. Apparently that's the end of my presentation. I don't know why it's not going down. Anyways, we're stuck. Apparently we're supposed to think about it. All right, so this year again we ran with the open formulation, 25 per meter, 2-week nursery, stock our animals. So here's our data. So we start feeding with automatic feeders about 30 days. So we stock our post-larvae, we ramp things up. And then we're feeding at anywhere from 130, 145, 160, or the AQ1 is managing itself. And you can see that our growth rates really are very similar here. So basically what I'm saying to myself is, hey, 130, 145, I can readjust my growth back here Now I can back calculate with the AQ1, but I want validation of stuff by hand feeding. Anyways, but when we get to here, we've fallen off. The 130 and 145 is no longer adequate. The shrimp are outgrowing that quantity of feed. Our 160 actually stayed with us till about right here, and then it falls off, and then our AQ1 took it out. So what we can do with this is we have all the AQ1 data, we can back calculate feed curves, and we have all our standardized feeding, which we can overlay on top of each other to again create a new feed curve for automatic feeders that supports this faster growth. And again, we're running 90 days where my old production used to be 120, and we're getting close. We're between 30 and 35 grams in 90 days in terms of growth. So here's our data. Again, as feed input goes up, and then the most feed is going to be put in by the AQ1, we get 26 to 32 grams. So our yields are, this is very good yield for us at that particular density and that level of production. But we've you got about 50% more with the AQ1. On a worldwide basis, if you look at performance with automatic feeders, on average, when I talk to people who have database that have been selling feeders and have large databases, there's about a 25% improvement in performance across the board. If you're going from 2 feedings a day to automatic feeders, you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. Here in Asia, it's not uncommon to feed 6 times a day, so you're not going to get as big an improvement. But you are going to get an improvement as you go to more feedings per day over a longer period of time. And I really think that the AQ1 system has lots of advantages. If you look at this from a historic perspective, in terms of our facility, this is what we used to do. It's a 120-day production cycle, 2 feedings per day. We're now at 90-day production cycle. And reality is, if I'm targeting a 20-some gram shrimp, I can now do a 60-day production cycle. So we've talked about doing 2 cycles per year because we can get to 20-plus grams in 60 days. And I view about 20-gram shrimp as the minimum. But by the key here is the feed is in the water for less time. I showed you data that if you have the feed in the water for over an hour, you have reduction in performance. So I think part of the nutritional response is, number one, I have feed in the water less time. The other response is, if you look at this is feed intake on shrimp over time. And so we basically just took feed and fed it to shrimp in an aquarium and measured consumption. If you only got an hour, you're going to get about yay much feed in that animal. If you can put many feedings, well, your intake of feed goes up. Okay, shrimp are not a carnivore. They're not going out and eating large meals. They have a relatively small stomach. What they do is they go out and eat very small meals very frequently. So you have to have the feed there and over an extended period of time. Well, if it's there in an extended period of time, it's leached. So the only way you can solve these 2 problems at the same time is go to some sort of automatic system, okay? Because you can put out very small quantities of feed very frequently. The way I describe this is you can either, if you're going to have a big party, let's say your daughter gets married or you're going to have a big celebration, you can have waiters, everybody sits down at tables, right? And you have a whole bunch of waiters bring the food to everybody. That's really expensive and it takes a lot of people. Or you can have a buffet and say, hey guys, you get up, you go get the food when you want it, right? That's all you're doing with automatic feeders, is you're essentially creating a buffet line. And this, technology's been, I've seen it from the very intensive, 500 plus shrimp per cubic meter down to the 5 shrimp per cubic meter extensive system. So I've seen these technologies work in 5-hectare ponds, and I've seen them work in very small ponds. There are limitations to using sound as a management tool. There are things that interfere with it. There are certain aerators that will cause a signal that's on top of that, and you can't separate it out. When it rains hard, rain sounds a lot like that, okay? So there are things that will interfere with that. So for example, for the AQ1, if rain, and it's a certain type of rain, it has to have the right frequency, But if there's a signal that's confounding things, for the AQ1, they simply turn it over to a timer feeder, and they just use it as a timer feeder, and then they come back when you want, once that interference is gone. So there's ways around these things. But it's not a perfect system. There are things that interfere with them. I've seen them in a lot of different systems. I have yet to see it in a raceway style system. No one has yet put one in a raceway type style system that I know of. They were looking at that last year when I talked to some people, but I have yet to see it. So there are things that potentially interfere, but these are in, you know, the Asian style super intensive system all the way down to very extensive systems. So to me, you know, if we're going to remain sustainable, if we're going to remain a producer of protein sources, we need to, you know, minimize our marine ingredients just because they're limited resources. And there's lots of ways, protein sources as well as lipids. I think we have those, lots of tools there that we can use. We need to maintain that our feed conversions are low, and that means we need to promote the use of natural productivity. You know, these biofloc, whatever you want to call the intensive systems, they're essentially biofloc systems or mixotrophic systems or whatever, but they have natural productivity that those shrimp are using. As long as we allow them to utilize that, I think that's a good thing. We need to let them do that. So I don't like overfeeding because I want them to actually use that natural productivity. We also have, you know, use of saltwater resources. No one else is using those resources. So for example, a lot of our coastal areas you can't do traditional agriculture because it's salinized. So we can use that for marine fish production, or we can go offshore. So we have lots of different advantages. And I think that that you're going to see the industry, you've already seen it in the salmon industry, it's pretty much taken over, but I think you're going to see a movement of people towards these automated systems. And there's both good and bad things about moving towards automated systems. But there's lots of vendors out there now where you can integrate your entire business model into your biological responses, and your business model can all be integrated in these cloud-based systems. And I think that that's a nice management tool. To me, you know, if I have somebody go out and feed an automatic, you know, fill up the automatic feeders instead of going out there 4 times a day to hand feed, there's better things that they can do with their time than filling up, you know, throwing feed by hand. During water quality, you know, instead of walking around with a DO meter checking DO, have an automated system that records it so it's 24 hours a day so everything's turned on and turned off. Feeding into your, you know, financial system so you can make decisions based on growth rates. So I think that these automated systems and these integrated systems are interesting. And then it's also a good way to share information in terms of diseases and whatnot if you're in these groups and whatnot. So there's lots of interesting things going on. The automated systems are coming online. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions if you got questions. Again, I've seen these systems from very low density to very high density. And I think that they're a very good way to invest money.